So today I woke up and Dad plays games down here. Thank you. He said, I believe I've heard Marco Meatball say something to that effect many times. It really is true, and isn't it? And the original tweet was from Borislav Slavov, who is obviously the composer of Divinity Original Sin 2, Baldur's Gate. And he said, a fellow colleague just wrote to me that video game soundtracks are the classical music of our time. I don't know if it's true, but it sounds beautiful. And of course, this sent me into a frenzy and made me laugh because I really do believe that. And I've been saying that since literally my first video 2 years ago. Video game music is the classical music of our time. This word classical is certainly a muddy one, referring to a time period and a lump sum category for a type of music. But in reality, millions upon millions of people are listening to orchestral writing now more than ever, which is a fact. It's an incredible fact, and I've reached more people through video game music than I ever could have as an opera singer singing in front of 4,000 people at night. It really is a really incredible thing, and I wanted to expand on this idea a little bit here with some examples of things that I've listened to over the last couple years. It really is a staggering fact that video game music as a genre really encompasses so many different styles. Of course, EDM, classical, modern rock, mixtures and fusions, country. I mean, every type of genre exists. And this idea of classical music being, I come from a classical music background, right? A decade of performance and singing in front of people and performing opera and so on and so forth. So naturally, I'm always going to gravitate towards the advocation of said style of music. But obviously, video game music covers all sorts of different things. But in this particular discussion, I wanted to talk about video game music as classical music, which is something I have been saying for a while now, in the idea that it's true. Video game music is classical music. And when we talk about classical music, it's a really tricky and complex thing, because when we look at the idea, classical music was essentially a concept, a term, like an umbrella term for anything relating to the sound of what we perceive of as classical music. But the reality of it actually is much deeper than that, because classical music, of course, was a specific type of music in a specific time period in history. The classical time period, classical art, classical painting, classical writing, classical whatever. And it's a really interesting thing, and in fact, the term classical, if you Google it really quickly, actually states relating to ancient Greek or Latin literature, art, or culture. But if you type in classical music is a funny thing, because on Wikipedia anyway, we have this idea that classical music generally refers to the art music of the Western world, considered to be distinct from Western folk music or popular music. Folk music is a different thing. Folk music tends to be passed down, tends to not be written, tends to be done by the ear, via rote. Classical music is distinguished as a Western classical music, and it's applied to characterized by formality and complexity in its musical forms and harmonic organization, particularly with the use of polyphony, which is multiple voices. Since at least the 9th century has been primarily a written tradition, spawning a sophisticated notational system as well as accompanying literature, blah, 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 blah. The point is, and in fact, yeah, it was rooted in the patronage of churches and royal courts in Western Europe, especially when we look at Bach and how Bach was writing predominantly for the church. You also have the difference between programmatic and absolute music, which absolute music was music that was written for a specific time period. Absolute music was music that was written for no real intended purpose, besides like if it was written for the church or something. It was written for the sake of writing beautiful music, right? And it's a really interesting thing. Don't let me get too far into this, because it is pretty complex. But all of the classical music, classical/orchestral music, let's call it orchestral from now on, all of the orchestral music that we hear in video games these days is programmatic. The purpose is to aid in telling a story. Now, we can get into a separate debate about whether or not we need to know context in order to appreciate the depth of music, and I will forever feel that we don't need to listen to certain pieces in context in order to have the deepest understanding. I think that's partly because I am I've spent 10 years just thinking about music, not so much where it's attached to. But of course, yes, contextually, music does matter, and it plays a huge, significant role in how we relate to and connect to music. But gosh, I mean, like, there's so many examples of video game music being orchestral / classical music. And it can be really anything. One of the craziest things to me, and again, I can never really catch every single example of this in my brain as I'm talking about it, but a prime example to me is something really basic, like Super Mario Galaxy's main theme, right? Like in theory, that is classical music. Now, it's not classical in the sense that it's not related to the time period by any stretch of the imagination, but it's orchestral, at least this particular rendition. I don't know if the original rendition is the same way, if it's composed this way, but that's classical music. I mean, that's orchestral music. Sure, it may not sound like it's in the style of Bach or Beethoven or whatever, but I still perceive that as classical music per se, even though it has a modern lilt to it. A more basic example of what I would perceive as true classical music would be basically all of the Dark Souls soundtrack, all of even the Bloodborne soundtrack, these FromSoft in general, and now of course we're thinking about Elden Ring because of the new DLC getting announced. Unless you're watching this 10 months from now, I hope you enjoyed the DLC. But like, something like Elden Beast is easily and quantifiably orchestral classical music. Everything in this track has the essence of orchestral classical composition and writing. A harp, whatever, like this is like a classical Western sound, right? So it's cool to me because, like, obviously not every track that we listen to, Bach, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Brahms, whoever, these folks obviously didn't include soprano singing in all of their pieces. In fact, most of their pieces, unless they were specifically written oratorio, which was for the church, or like ensemble choral pieces, those obviously have singing. But in general, we don't hear that very often. So this is classical music, right? This is theoretically the evolution of classical music. And what's amazing to me is that it's in the context of video games. And how many people, 2 million people, listen to Elden Beast on this extended track here that I'm looking at on YouTube. That's insane. I'm not sure what the numbers are when we look at the classical music world, but even the fact that there are 2 million people that have listened to this particular piece of music, not counting the entire soundtrack, is crazy. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't like classical music, or I only like it in specific settings or whatever. And it's like, that may be true, but you're not against it. And I think that makes a huge difference. I mean, another prime example from Final Fantasy 16, more recent, is Away. Like, when I think classical music, I think of that. I think of Carmina Burana. I think of Dies Irae. I think of anything that involves chorus, especially when you get to this part. It sucks because I can't actually play you any like legitimate classical examples because I immediately get flagged by the incredibly shitty copyright system of classical music, but that's no different than the Verdi Requiem. I was listening to Nostalgia Phantasm the other day. This is, I mean, almost directly pulled from something that Giuseppe Verdi would have written. And let me remind you that Giuseppe Verdi was alive in freaking, I can't remember his dates, but it's like 1813 to 1901. And so much of the stuff that we hear in opera choruses, or especially in the Verdi Requiem, is basically just pulled from this. I mean, this is insane to me. Like that's crazy to me, because this is music that I literally spent a decade trying to like learn and be really good at and understand. And yet here we are, and it just like exists in our video games. This video has been watched 3 million times. So 3 million people have either, fought this particular raid boss or experienced this soundtrack. And let alone, we're not even talking about like some of the more purely classical pieces. Like I'm thinking about Eternal Wind from Final Fantasy III. That's been on my mind a little bit recently. Like, isn't that just so gorgeous? But point is, like, Zephyr Memories, The Legend of the Eternal Wind from Final Fantasy III is a legitimate piece of classical music. Was it written in the classical time period? No. Is it legitimate orchestral music? Are composers that we listen to every single day in one capacity or another writing music that's classical? 1,000,000%. Even something like the Helldivers 2 theme is theoretically orchestral classical music. And it's crazy because people are playing this right now, breaking the servers, and yet they may not even realize how much they are being moved by a piece that basically sounds like Holst's Jupiter or any sort of classical piece that we would think about from that specific corner of the music world. And I'm always really amused when people are like, I don't like classical music, or classical music is uppity or stuck up. And it's like, well, you're listening to it actively every single day if you're playing video games. And it's also been interesting for me because a lot of people don't listen to music in video games. And it's like, how do you not do that? But it's crazy. I mean, like listen to this. This is like a proper... And so what I think we're actually seeing is the renaissance of classical music is not occurring within the industry of classical music itself, but actually occurring in the video game music industry. You know what I mean? And I just played Grand Blue Fantasy Relink, and I know that a lot of these tunes that I'm like pointing out are just things that are top of mind, and that's just how the world works. Like for me, like if I'm playing it, it's in front of me, so I like see it. But like, listen to this. You hear that, you hear that everywhere in classical writing. And that sounds like a church hymn. And the church is, forget that. That's a whole separate discussion about how church music like directly impacts the liturgical world and how we perceive or believe in God and the universe and, these things that are larger than us. I mean, choral writing and church music goes back, the ages of Bach, St. Matthew Passion, St. John Passion, the Bach Magnificat in D, all of these things that are talking about these religious concepts. But this, the Grand Blue Fantasy Relink is doing the exact same thing, but in 2024. It's stupidly cool. But what's really cool about Grand Blue Fantasy and a lot of this style and is that we then take it and we modify it. And that's one of the exciting things about video games, is that because there's no rules and because there's no like guidelines on how people do what they do, we can go and turn that beautiful classical soundscape and then go into this. Like, that's the same freaking song, you know what I mean? And then if you think about like a piece like One Winged Angel as a prime example, One Winged Angel was borrowed from the idea of The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. Check this stuff out. The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky is a brutally gruff and intense piece, symbolizing, and this is a programmatic piece. Well, it's a tone poem, and it describes an event, and there's no visuals. You just have to use your ear. And the tone poem essentially is describing the story of a pagan ritual and sacrificing a woman at the altar. And what's cool is that then Uematsu took that idea and created, one of the most iconic boss themes in the world, not counting Dancing Mad, which is its own like classical organ concerto, with multiple different movements where we have one main instrument coupled with the orchestra and choir in this particular case backing up that organ. I mean, but like even just the way it starts, and I know One Winged Angel, but like check this out. It's not this piece. This is the remake version, which is too long. Like that's, and then what's even nuts is that we borrow Estuan Simperidus ira menaventi from Carmina Burana when the chorus comes in. So these are lyrics that are used in a classical music piece that then Uematsu took, borrowed, changed around, stole like an artist, and created one of the most iconic video game soundtracks in the world. And anybody who likes One Winged Angel, I guarantee you're going to also like classical music. And the reason why I'm ranting about this is not because I believe that classical music needs to be like protected or saved. Frankly, I don't care. But what I really, really appreciate about classical music is how deeply it can like dig into our humanity and into our artistic spirit of sorts. And also what I really appreciate is just how many people are being exposed to classical music that probably think that it sucks, which is even funnier. I think about such a voracious fan base like Genshin Impact's, and I think about La Signora a lot. I mean, La Signora's theme is a prime example of taking something that we know, classical writing that we hear in orchestras all across the United States and the world, and then we flip it and we add something really nice. Like when we add this freaking electric guitar here. This is classical writing, like at the foundation of classical writing. Like that's so cool to me. But then you even go, back to Bloodborne, and we take Gehrman the First Hunter, and what's crazy about that is that is, you could literally put Gehrman the First Hunter, and this is why I get kind of pissy with classical music programming, because classical music programming is so scared because money, it's all from donors and it's all from supporters. It's non-for-profit. And classical music is afraid, the industry, I would say, is afraid of losing money and afraid of going under and afraid of entering into the black and not having the balls to take a risk and say, you know what, I'm going to try something different. But like, they probably don't even know that this exists, which is also a whole other conversation about how the classical music industry world is completely separate from the video game music world, which is so incredibly dumb because they're literally doing the exact same thing, but reaching this one over here, the video game music world, is reaching so many more people than this world is. And this world has its people. I'm not denying that classical music lovers are incredibly passionate, wonderful people, but it's a really funny problem because if you listen to this, you're like, oh, I picked the slowest part right here. Like that is good that is such good classical writing. That is such good classical writing. That's so exciting. That's so exciting as a person that spent 10 years doing it. To hear that 13 million views, you guys, on a video from 8 years ago. That's fucking crazy. And that's like numbers I don't know how many people go to orchestral. I've never done the research because I haven't ever been interested in knowing how many people attend classical music concerts, but 13 million people in 8 years. And I guarantee you so many of these 13 million people have never been to an orchestra concert. And yet here you are giving them this in Bloodborne. That's amazing. That's ridiculous. And I haven't even like touched on like some of the older games that have tried to emulate the soundscape of what it, you know, the soundscape of classical music. You look at like Castlevania, right? Like, what's one that I heard recently? Oh, it was Lost Painting from Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Like, let me fast forward. That doesn't prove my point too much, but there's still like an underpinning of classical music in there. God, I think it was Heavenly Doorway. Hold on. Yeah, the harpsichord in here. Like that's classical writing, right? That's wild to me. Or if you look at Babylon's Fall, a game that literally nobody played and it died upon arrival, and yeah, it was Dance of Pearls, but it doesn't matter. Listen to this. This is absolutely nuts. I could sing that. Like that writing, you guys, is legitimately something you could go to an opera and hear today. This writing in Babylon's Fall is some of the best writing I have heard in video game music in the way that it emulates classical music, right? In the way that it is classical music. But then what's even crazier, and I'm not done, this rant is going to go on for a little bit. This is going to be the longest video I've ever put out. I'm not even going to edit this shit. Like the other thing that's crazy is that you look at a guy like Borislav Slavov, right? And you listen to, I really like Ifan's theme, and that's been on my mind since I talked with him today. But like, listen to this. Listen to how Borislav literally takes medieval, and this is what makes Borislav such an amazing composer, is Borislav will take medieval instruments that are not part of the lexicon that any of us are even thinking about, and he will turn that into modern music that people listen to. All of Baldur's Gate 3, obviously Baldur's Gate 3 has blown up, right? But like, Raphael's final act, which is like a Disney song / mixed in with like Sprechstimme, which is like spoken word. It's a legitimate piece that you could probably you would hear it in an opera. 4.5 million views, right? Now I understand that people love what's occurring with Raphael in that moment. It's like intense. It's like crazy. The music's, but like, that's something that's a valid, like orchestral and classical performance that you could hear in a hall. And people don't think that because it's in the video game, and you know what? It doesn't even matter. But like, listen to Ifan's theme, Meat and Gold, or Meat, Gold and Blood. Now, granted, 345,000 views in 6 years, but like that is colossal when you think about the fact that that's medieval stylings, medieval ways of writing, medieval use of instruments, medieval ways of composition. And then what's even cooler about video games in general is that then we take the classical music tropes and we just say, you know what, I'm gonna do something completely different. And that's what you get with freaking Jesper Kyd. And so that's the cool thing about video game music to me, is that video game music follows draws within the lines of what we would perceive of as orchestral or slash in the umbrella of classical music. But it also says, you know what, fuck your rules. I'm going to go ahead and do this. And it's willing to say, I'm doing this my way. You know, unfortunately, I get a lot of copyright issues with Skyrim or with Bethesda games, but Skyrim, all these things are prime examples of really good classical music that stays within the lines. Guild Wars 2, a lot of these MMOs, WoW stays within the lines of like what we perceive of as classical orchestral music. And that's not an issue, but like that's incredible writing, incredibly modern writing from the last decade that is literally continuing on in the tradition of what we would perceive of as music from 200, 300, 400 years ago. And that's crazy. Video game music is classical music. And I'm very happy to say that because of this tweet. A fellow colleague just wrote to me that video game soundtracks are the classical music of our time. I don't know if it's true, but it sounds beautiful. And yes, it does.